One of my close relatives built a home within a forest many years ago, along with buying nearly 200 acres of the forest around their house. They're big hunters and wildlife people, and the actual house that they built was very nice. You'd think they were multimillionaires if you saw it, but because it was so far isolated, the actual house itself wasn't worth nearly as much as it would be if it were closer to a city or hell, even just a town. Anyway, I used their property to go on camping excursions pretty often, maybe 3 or 4 times a year. It was just an easy, safe way to enjoy some time in the forest without having to think too much about it or plan the backpacking route. I could just show up and head into the forest. Something to note is that a portion of their property actually used to be very close to a logging site. That, of course, is now many years abandoned, but there were several structures left over, some of which were part of the acreage on my relative's property. For this trip, I thought I'd check out some of the shelters. I got to the house around 10 a.m. and headed out at 1. The walk to the old logging site was 40-ish minutes. There wasn't a defined route or path to walk along, so I had to bushwhack my way through. When I got there, I was actually pretty surprised how untouched it looked. Looked no different than any other shelter or cabin you'd see built in the woods that people actually lived in. I assumed it was because no one ever visited this area, or even really knew about it. Although there was only one shelter. The other structures were actually toppled over and just piles of wood, so I couldn't even tell what they used to be. I walked over and managed to push the door open. Inside the cabin was a long row of bunk beds. I'd say 8 beds lined up on either wall. They were all completely rusted over, and most of the mattresses seemed to be ripped apart by rodents and animals over all the years. Aside from that, it was empty. No old relics left behind from the loggers, and no signs of anyone ever having been there since they left over a century ago. I spent 15 minutes inside having a look around. Then, with nothing else to see, I headed out. Seeing that all the other structures were toppled over, I figured I wouldn't test my luck and would just camp near the shelter, rather than inside of it. I set up my tent just 100 or so yards from the shelter and built a small campfire, sitting around it for a few hours. When the sun set, I stoked the fire and started cooking some food. And it was as I was doing that, I heard footsteps approaching from the direction of the cabin, which now in the dark was no longer visible. I only had time to stand up before a man came into the light from the fire. He looked like he was in his 40s, very dirty and rugged. And maybe it's just because I was at an old logging site, but he kinda looked like what I'd imagine a stereotypical logger would look like. Now, I'm a fairly big dude, but this man was huge, enough to make me feel a little bit threatened. "Hey buddy, I'm looking for my friend. Said he'd be around here, but I can't seem to find him. You didn't happen to have seen anyone, have you?" He kept walking closer as he was talking, and sort of looked around the woods as if looking for his friend, or looking for anyone I was with. "No, sorry, I haven't seen anyone at all." I didn't have the courage to tell him this was private property, and that no one else should even be here, including him. The man smiled and nodded like he understood. Then he just stood there looking at me for an uncomfortable amount of time, before saying goodnight and walking back into the forest. Then it was empty and quiet again. It was terrifying how sudden and quickly all that had happened. What the hell was that man doing here? And where'd his friend go? And honestly, the thing that scared me the most was how comfortable he was just walking right up to my campfire, being in the middle of an uninhabited part of the forest. Something wasn't right, and with that feeling, I started to pack my things, undecided whether I'd leave, but doing it just in case. Once my bags were packed, I finished cooking my dinner. And with the feeling still in me that something was wrong, I made the decision that it wasn't worth staying, when I could just walk back to the house and not risk anything. I took the tent down, put my backpack on, and smothered the fire. I walked just a minute or two into the trees, when suddenly I heard footsteps approaching quickly ahead of me. I stopped and stood still, hoping he'd run right past and not see me. But unfortunately, he didn't. The footsteps came right up to me, and the man stopped just within sight. It was so dark though, I couldn't see much aside from his basic features, and the guy looked very similar to the other man that came up to my campsite. This had to be the friend he was looking for. That is, if he was actually lost. Your friend was looking for you. He went that way, by the logging shelter, I nervously said and pointed behind me. The man didn't move. Where is he? Where is your friend? He's that way. I pointed again. Where is he? He repeated himself. I couldn't really see what expression he was making on his face, but he had this eerie, monotone, deadpan voice. I didn't know how to respond. And then I heard footsteps behind me, very slow, like someone was creeping up through the trees just 20 feet away. I was too scared to take my eyes off of the man right in front of me, though. After hesitating, I trusted my gut and just started walking. I walked right past the guy right in front of me, and his head turned as I did, following my movement. I could feel his eyes watching me as I kept walking deeper into the forest, but I refused to look back. I think I was trying to not show how afraid I was. As I got further out, I heard footsteps move to where the other guy was, so they were both next to each other, but neither said a word. It was like they were both just standing and watching me walk away. Once I was out of sight and hearing distance, I booked it through the dark all the way back to the house. Never saw anything or anyone follow me. The next day, I told my relatives what happened out there, and it seemed like they almost didn't believe me. They didn't seem worried about it at all, and were almost just more confused, or even possibly worried about me. I don't know what happened out there, or who those men were, but something tells me I made the right call by leaving. And while I've been back to their house several times since then, I never went back into that forest around their house, unsure who or what is really out there. When I was in my early 20s, about 6 years ago from now, I took a big turn in the direction of my life and moved very far away, into a small cabin surrounded by nothing but forest. I rented it, so the only thing I could fall back on was that after 6 months, if I hated it, I could move out and put that part of my life behind me. The cabin was about 50 minutes outside of the closest real town, but only 10-ish minutes from the closest area with other houses and a gas station and whatnot. I wouldn't call it a full-on town though. The first 3 months were quiet, and I really don't have much to say about it. I think I was still in the honeymoon phase of living somewhere new and feeling the freedom of being alone all day. But it was after those 3 months, and over the course of just a week, that this awful feeling started to build up in me. At first, I tried to ignore it because there was no reason to think it was justified, but it only got worse. The best way I could describe it was like this deeply dreadful feeling every time I stepped out of the cabin and went into the woods. It got to the point where it was so uncomfortable that I stopped going outside. Part of the reason I moved out there was because I worked from my laptop at home, and so I can be out in nature enjoying the woods instead of sitting in an office building inside all day. So even though I didn't really have to go outside, I wanted to. Or I guess I wanted to want to. But the feeling was honestly unbearable. I thought it must have been like what people with severe psychotic paranoia feel like. That's how bad it was. After that week, I was so bothered by it, and still having no reason for feeling that way, I made a really dumb decision, which was to just force myself to walk out into the woods. Not toward the roads or down a trail, but just out into the trees. Face my fears, so to speak. Thinking that if I just saw that nothing was wrong, then it would go away. I walked outside and past the tree line, and the fear started getting really intense. I was looking all around, but the woods almost felt dead. It was completely still and dead quiet. My mind was screaming at me to run out of the trees and get back inside the cabin, but I stayed put, and then I started walking further in. It almost feels crazy even writing about this, because it makes me sound insane, doing all this over just some untraceable feeling. However, I got just far enough to where my cabin wasn't really visible through all the trees, when everything just amplified in intensity. My heart started beating really fast, and that dreadful sense was killing me. And then, completely out of nowhere, I heard a voice. My eyes shot to my right. There was a woman walking toward me, calling out to me. She looked genuinely just like a normal woman going for a walk. She came right up to me, introducing herself as Lynn. I was still feeling extremely off, and was so caught off guard it took me a moment to recollect myself and say hi back. She smiled and said she was just going for a walk and asked if I wanted to join her. The way she talked was over-the-top friendly, almost flirty, which again caught me off guard. I said sorry, that I was just checking on something and was on my way back home, but I asked where she came from. She looked behind her and said she lived around here, still smiling and still being very friendly. She asked again to join her on a walk, that she wasn't going very far and that it'd be fun. Something about her I didn't trust at all, and I started to become very aware of how weird this was. I shook my head and said thanks for the offer, but that I was okay. And as I started to turn around and walk off, she kept her smile, and in that same friendly voice, she said one last thing. "You shouldn't be here." By the time I processed it and turned back around to look at her and ask what she meant by that, she was already walking away. I stood there frozen, thinking I must have misheard her. No way she said that in such a happy, friendly tone. I watched her walk away for a whole 30 seconds, and slowly, as she started disappearing between the trees, the dreadful feeling that still hadn't left me started to fade. It got less and less intense, and then it was like everything was quiet again. I looked around one more time, then hurried back to the cabin. I decided right then that I was leaving. Something was wrong with this forest, and I did not want to be there another day to figure out what it was. I didn't have that much stuff, so I was able to fit most of it into my truck. It took the rest of the day though, and I didn't finish packing the last bag until a couple hours past sunset. And that's when the feeling came back. It was suddenly so intense, that aching, dreadful feeling. I walked over to the window, and right away I saw a figure standing in the tree line. It was that woman. She was just standing in the dark, watching my cabin. I hurried to pack the last bag and then ran out to my truck, getting in and driving away. I felt relieved once I was back on the road and far from the cabin. In the next several days, I ended up getting out of the lease, but having to pay for the rest of the month still. I don't regret it at all, though. I'm not sure what that feeling really was, or how it was connected to the woman. I genuinely have no explanation or anything for it. But I want no part of whatever is going on around that cabin. This was during a small trip to Utah I'd taken a few years ago. I'd never really taken a dedicated vacation just to stay at a cabin or Airbnb or anything like that. Every vacation always needed a purpose, like visiting a city or doing something exciting. But just like everyone else who does this, I thought going out to stay in a small cabin far away would feel relaxing and give me some peace of mind. I didn't want to think about planning anything, or really do anything at all. The cabin I booked was part of a small community in the woods of northern Utah, right by the border of Idaho. When I say small community, I mean like 6 other cabins nearby that were also rentable. Aside from that, nothing else was out there. The road leading off the highway was a thin gravel road for about 6 miles. At the end were the multiple trails that led to each of the rental cabins. I turned onto the dirt trail that was marked Cabin 4, which took me the last 2 miles to my cabin. It was very small, and I don't know what I was really expecting, but the place looked like it was just thrown right in the middle of the forest. What I mean by that is they didn't clear out any area for it. The cabin was just built right between all the trees, with some being just a few feet away from the walls. It looked a little off, like claustrophobic, but obviously not really a problem. I went in and started unpacking. I only brought a small backpack with clothes for the week, and my basic essentials, as well as a small cooler with food and drinks. Figured that would be all I needed. I was inside the cabin for only, I don't know, maybe 10 minutes, when a sudden knock at the door startled me. Without even knowing who it was or what it was for, my heart started racing. It was the abrupt shift from silence that freaked me out. I walked up to the door, and with no way to look out first, I opened it. There was a tall man, probably in his 30s, giving a friendly smile. He said that he was just checking to make sure I was okay. For a split second, I got chills. I think because the way he asked it made it sound like something had happened. But I quickly realized he was probably just the owner, or employee or something. Honestly, I felt dumb for taking it the other way at first. "Yeah, I think it'll be perfect. Thanks for checking on me." He nodded, and it looked like that was it, so I closed the door. I went back to unpacking, but I think it was just 30 seconds later that I thought about it for a moment, and curiously went back to the door and opened it. The man was gone, but what I was looking for was how he got here. I didn't remember seeing a car behind him, and I also knew none of the other cabins or anything were close enough for him to have walked here so quickly after I'd arrived. The forest was very quiet, and there were no signs of where the man had walked off to, even though it hadn't even been a full minute since I'd closed the door. I thought it was weird and sort of wrote it off like a joke, like he'd teleported or something. At the end of the day, I didn't think it really mattered. I closed the door and got back to unpacking. When I was done, I laid on the couch and took a long nap. I think from around 3 to almost 7 p.m., way longer than I was expecting to. I got up feeling great though, and knew I'd be staying up for the night after that kind of nap. I grabbed one of the beers from the cooler, then headed out to the front porch. It was perfect weather, not too cold and no wind. I sat down on a wooden chair that was left out there, and just looked out into the forest. Without any wind, even the trees were quiet. No rustling leaves or anything. The sun had probably set 45 minutes ago, so it was very dark, but not fully pitch black yet. After being out there for 10 minutes, I don't know if because I'd unconsciously seen something, or if it was just purely a gut feeling, but I started getting that very real feeling that I was being watched, like someone was out there in the dark looking at me. I kept sipping on my beer and acting like nothing was wrong, hoping I could convince myself to stop worrying. 30 more minutes went by. The woods got much darker, and with no lights on the outside of the cabin, I honestly couldn't see anything. I could make out the nearby trees, but that was about it. I chugged the rest of what I had, then went back inside, still feeling off. I tried getting the fireplace going, but it wouldn't work. It was one of those old gas fireplaces, and I guess the cabin wasn't connected to a gas line because it wouldn't light at all. So I sat on the couch and just looked out the window next to me. Had nothing else to really do. Now, to describe the layout of this cabin, it was just a very small living area with a couch and a small table, and a bedroom on the left side with a small connected bathroom. That was it. No other rooms in the cabin at all. The reason I feel the need to mention that is because while I was sitting there looking out the window, I suddenly heard what sounded like something getting knocked over, with stuff falling on the ground. But when I quickly turned toward the sound, it had come from the back right of the cabin, the side where there was no other room or anything. But it was also muffled, like it maybe came from outside. I mean, where else could it have come from? And honestly, I would not have checked if it were just a thump or something, but it sounded like something possibly breaking, so I felt like I had to check. I quickly grabbed my phone, which was the only flashlight I had, then headed out and around to the back of the cabin. I never went back there, but when I rounded the corner and looked, I instantly felt a little more uneasy. There was a short set of stairs going under the cabin, and at the bottom, the door was open. It looked like some sort of crossbase or basement, but my phone light couldn't reach past the doorway. It was just pitch black. The longer I stood there, the more this unsettling, horrible feeling came over me. I took a step down, very slowly and quietly going down to the doorway. I just wanted to get close enough for my light to look in there, just to see if it was an animal that knocked something over or something else, and make sure I was okay. I got all the way down to the bottom, and this basement was really just a large concrete closet, very small and with just a couple of shelves. A bunch of stuff was scattered on the floor, definitely the source of what I'd heard up in the cabin. But right away, I heard something behind me. I turned around and shined the flashlight up the stairs. My eyes widened. There was a man at the top staring down at me. It was the man that came up to the cabin earlier, right when I'd arrived at the cabin. I muttered out a shaky hello, but the man just walked off. I heard his footsteps move away from the stairs, and after a second, I hurried back up. I shined my phone toward the part of the woods I heard him walk toward, but it barely reached a couple feet ahead. It was just way too dark, and I couldn't see him anywhere. It was like he just vanished again. Obviously, at this point, I was severely unsettled and wanted to get the hell out of these woods. I ran inside and locked the door while I packed my bag, then quickly threw it and my cooler into the car and started driving away. It took a long time to get out of the forest and back onto the main road. I drove an hour until I got to a motel to sleep at. The next morning, I called the number on the booking website that I rented the cabin from. I wanted both an explanation and a refund, but I only got one of those. The owner that picked up, I immediately could tell was a different guy, from his voice and the way he spoke. Sounded like he was in his 60s and was just a nice older man. He told me several things that made everything even more unsettling. He said he was the only one that lived even remotely close to the cabins, and that he didn't have any other employees. And that night I was there, none of the other cabins were rented out. It should have been just me out there. I stayed another day at the motel, and me and the owner met up to talk to the police. But after that, I don't know what happened. I never got any more calls or updates. However, as I was writing this, I looked up the cabin rental again for the first time since being there. And it's gone. No mention of it closing or what happened at all. If anything, that just confirms to me that something dark was going on near those cabins, and I was lucky my encounter ended with me getting away.